The humid air of coastal South Carolina in 1985 always seemed to settle heavy on Fort Clay, much like the weight of Captain Eleanor Ellie Vance's past. Now known simply as Ms. Vance, she was the civilian coordinator for the base's old archives, a job that suited her quiet nature. The war had ended 40 years ago, but for Ellie, the battles continued, fought not with rifles, but with dismissive glances and bureaucratic red tape. Ellie had been a hero, though no medal recognized it. In the chaos of Germany in 1945, she hadn't fired a shot. Instead, she had used her sharp mind and logistical genius to save lives in a way the generals hadn't intended. Yet, to the men who still ran the local Veterans Committee, men like Colonel Robert Hawthorne, who'd been an aide when she was a captain, she was forever just the pencil pusher. Captain Vance, still shuffling paper. Hawthorne had chuckled the week before, his voice loud enough to carry across the main hall. "Some of us were out there winning the war, Eleanor. Some of us were in the back filing requisitions for soap." Ellie had simply smiled, a thin, tight expression, and hadn't corrected him. She was used to it. She was used to her service, critical, life-saving, logistical, being dismissed as women's work. They saw the neatly stacked supply crates. They didn't see the freezing, starving children those crates were meant for. Today, dusting a forgotten corner of the archive, Ellie pulled out a heavy cardboard box labeled simply, Operation KK Unfiled. The box was hers, packed away by her decades ago. She broke the brittle seal and lifted the lid. Inside, among sheaves of yellowing manifests, were small hand-drawn pictures, crude drawings of American jeeps, smiling soldiers, and tiny German flags. KK stood for Kleine Kinder, little children. This was the record of her sacrifice. In the final weeks of the war, she had encountered a group of child soldiers, boys barely 13, terrified and dressed in oversized, muddy uniforms. Official protocol dictated they be treated as prisoners of war. Ellie couldn't stomach it. They weren't soldiers. They were kids who had been lied to and left to starve. She made a choice that risked her entire career, quietly rerouting food, blankets, and temporary shelter to these boys, treating them with a compassion that bypassed the cold military regulations. The biggest obstacle then, as now, was Hawthorne. He had been a strict believer in following every order to the letter, and he had threatened to court-martial her for insubordination, accusing her of wasting resources needed for real fighting men. Now, 40 years later, the records of her mission, her true service, were buried in this unlabeled box. She pulled out a manifest detailing the misappropriated supplies. It was proof of her bravery and her insubordination. She knew Hawthorne, who now controlled the archives budget, would crush her if she tried to formally document this history. He didn't want the paperwork or the truth to surface. As she gently traced the outline of a crayon drawing, a simple picture of a girl with a kind face, the children's memory of her, she felt the familiar knot of frustration and the enduring weight of injustice. Her deepest fear was that her act of pure human kindness, the only thing that truly mattered from her service, would be forever erased. Ellie spent the next few weeks secretly compiling the contents of the KK box. She worked late, the only sound the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the scratching of her pen on legal pads. She realized that Hawthorne hadn't just forgotten her work. He had actively suppressed it. A key document, the original field report from the combat unit that found the boys, which explicitly stated the children were too young to classify as POWs, was missing from the official file, but she found a carbon copy in her private box. One Tuesday, a young woman named Clara Jensen arrived at the archives. Clara was a local community college historian working on a paper about women's roles in WW2 logistics. She was bright, energetic, and completely focused on the typical narratives. "I'm really looking for stories about the real challenges," Clara explained, her eyes scanning the dusty shelves. "The combat nurses, the WASPs. You know, the women who defied expectations." Ellie felt the familiar sting. "I was a captain in supply logistics, Miss Jensen. I helped manage the flow of food and fuel for 2 divisions. Clara politely hid a yawn. Right, logistics. Important, of course, but, you know, it's a little administrative. I mean, where's the grit? Where's the moral gray area? The young woman's unintentional dismissal was a verbal echo of Hawthorne's lifelong insults. Ellie took a deep breath, fighting the urge to tell Clara to leave. Instead, she pointed to the unlabeled box. The moral gray area. "Miss Jensen," Ellie said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register, "is when your orders tell you to treat starving orphaned children as enemy combatants. And your conscience tells you to save them, knowing that if you get caught, your entire career and maybe your life is over. I think that qualifies as defying expectations." Clara looked startled, then intrigued. "Child soldiers? German?" "Yes, near the town of Regensburg. Boys as young as 12. No parents, no officers, just uniforms and cold fear." Ellie opened the KK box and showed Clara one of the crude crayon drawings. "I was in charge of the supplies. I saw those boys and saw my own little brother. I broke every rule in the book to keep them warm and fed for 5 days until a civilian relief organization could take them over. I risked a court-martial. Hawthorne knows this. That's why these records are unfiled. He wanted the official history to show cold compliance, not messy, expensive compassion." Clara, now fully focused, picked up the carbon copy of the missing field report. Her historian's instinct kicked in. She realized this wasn't just a story. It was a verifiable cover-up, a significant injustice done to a brave woman by a powerful, small-minded man. "This is proof, Miss Vance," Clara whispered, holding the fragile paper. "Hawthorne didn't just dismiss your work. He actively hid it because it exposed his own inflexibility and, frankly, his lack of humanity." Ellie nodded, her eyes fierce. "He saw logistics. I saw children. He wanted procedure. I gave them a future. I sacrificed my official recognition to keep them safe. Now, 40 years later, it's time to show the world what true service looked like." Ellie closed her eyes, and the archive's dust and the sound of Clara's typing faded, replaced by the bitter, smoky smell of 1945. She was 24, a captain in a sea of men who constantly questioned her decisions. Her uniform was always pressed, her reports perfect. She had to be flawless to be taken seriously. Her area was a rail yard outside a bombed-out village, Regensburg. The war was functionally over, but the chaos was total. One evening, a jittery private named Slocum brought a grim discovery to her rail car. "Captain Vance, we found them down by the river. They got uniforms, but they're tiny. They're kids. Hitler Youth, they look like." Ellie grabbed her clipboard and went. The sight hit her like a punch to the gut. About 15 boys huddled in the remains of a warehouse. They were thin, lice-ridden, and their eyes held the deep, vacant fear of people who had seen too much death. One boy, no older than 12, with startling blue eyes and a face smeared with soot, clutched a splintered piece of wood like a weapon. His name, she would learn later, was Klaus. The protocol was clear and cold. Treat any uniformed person as a POW. Ellie knew that meant days, maybe weeks in a harsh temporary holding area, probably with too little food and absolutely no proper medical attention. They would be interrogated and forgotten. "Private Slocum," she commanded, her voice firm, "go back to the depot. You will file a requisition for emergency winterized canvas and rations for 10 men suffering from shell shock. You will bring it here. You will mark the manifest as damaged in transit." Slocum blinked. "But, Captain, that's for full-sized fighting men, and that's a lie." "The truth is," Ellie said, looking at the freezing boys, "that we have 15 human beings who will die of exposure and starvation by morning if we treat them like enemy soldiers. This requisition is for human beings. Do you have a problem following my order, Private?" Slocum's gaze shifted from her eyes to the small, shivering children. "No, Captain." "No problem at all. For the next 5 days, Ellie ran her secret mission. She had the boys housed in the warehouse using the emergency supplies. She found an elderly German woman who spoke broken English to act as a temporary guardian. She even used her personal ration of chocolate bars to help calm their jitters. She taught them simple English words, and they taught her German words for thank you. She saw them stop clutching their fists and start clutching blankets. Klaus, the boy with the blue eyes, gave her the first crayon drawing, the portrait of a kind lady. Her cover was blown when Colonel Hawthorne arrived for a surprise inspection. He found the missing rations and the warehouse full of boys. "Vance, what in God's name is this unauthorized operation?" "These are enemy soldiers! They belong in a stockade!" Hawthorne roared, his face purple with outrage. "Sir," Ellie stood ramrod straight, "they are children. They are non-combatant, malnourished minors. They are too small to operate the weapons they carry. I used my discretion to preserve life and resources by separating them from the main POW population." Hawthorne slammed his fist on a crate. "Insubordination, Captain! You risked a vital supply line for sentiment. You will file a full report, and you will be facing charges." Ellie knew her career was over. She would be reprimanded, maybe discharged. But as she watched Klaus wave shyly from the back of the Red Cross truck that finally arrived, she knew her sacrifice was worth every insult. She had saved their future. Back in the bright clinical light of the 1985 archive, Ellie took a steadying breath. Clara was reviewing the files, her earlier skepticism replaced by determined fury. "Hawthorne didn't just threaten you, Ms. Vance," Clara summarized, pointing to a margin note on a typed memo. He rewrote history. "See this note? Logistical anomaly, unnecessary expenditure." That's how he officially characterized feeding 15 children for 5 days. This man is running the local Veteran of the Year committee now, and he's claiming moral authority. Ellie felt a cold certainty. He was so obsessed with following the rule book that he couldn't stand the idea that an act of mercy, orchestrated by a woman, was more effective and more moral than his rigidity. He made sure the official record showed I was reckless, not compassionate. Clara had access to more recent archives and electronic databases. She began digging into Hawthorne's military records and post-service career. What they found was a pattern. Hawthorne had blocked the creation of any official humanitarian service citation in the years immediately following the war, arguing it would set a precedent for emotional decision-making. He had successfully protected his own image as the uncompromising, disciplined officer by burying Ellie's story. "We have to expose this," Clara insisted. "The local paper is hosting a big spread on the Veteran of the Year banquet next week. Hawthorne is the keynote speaker. This is our chance," Ellie hesitated. "I don't want revenge, Clara. I want the truth. I don't want to bring down a decorated veteran just to clear my name. It feels—" "It's not about revenge, Ms. Vance," Clara interrupted gently. "It's about justice for the truth. It's about showing that the real sacrifice wasn't just being in the heat of battle, it was choosing humanity over procedure. It's about proving that your compassion was an act of bravery worthy of respect, not scorn." Clara's words, "worthy of respect," resonated deep in Ellie's heart. She looked at the crayon drawing Klaus had given her 40 years ago. Justice wasn't about a medal. It was about honoring the pure, simple choice she made. "All right, Clara," Ellie said, her hand resting on the KK box. "We use what we found. We don't attack the man. We expose the paper trail. We show them the real logistical anomaly was the heart in the supply chain." They spent the next 72 hours compiling a meticulous case, the original field report, the misappropriated supply manifest, and Hawthorne's marginal notes. The evidence was irrefutable. Ellie's long journey toward vindication was finally at the point of confrontation. The Veteran of the Year banquet was held in the old Fort Clay officers' mess hall, a massive, echoing room draped with flags and dignity. Colonel Hawthorne, looking sharp in his suit, was giving his keynote address, droning on about discipline, chain of command, and the hard, cold necessities of war. Ellie and Clara waited quietly in the back. Ellie, dressed simply but impeccably, held a manila envelope. Her hands were steady. Hawthorne finished his speech to polite applause, and the local paper's editor, Mr. Peterson, stepped up to the podium. "Before we move to dessert," he said, "I have one final piece of business. We've received some stunning archival material this week that we feel honors a different kind of wartime service, a service that reminds us that humanity, even in the darkest hours, is the highest form of bravery." The room grew silent. Ellie walked forward, Clara following with a slide projector. Ellie stood next to the podium, declining the microphone. Her voice, though unamplified, carried an astonishing authority. 40 years ago, she began, looking directly at Colonel Hawthorne, whose face had gone pale, I risked my career to save 15 German children near Regensburg. They were child soldiers, but they were mostly just hungry. Terrified little boys, she nodded to Clara, who projected the first image, the carbon copy of the field report, stating the children were non-combatants. The second image was the emergency winterized canvas and rations manifest. My actions were necessary, Ellie continued, but they were later deemed unnecessary expenditure by the person who wrote this note. Clara projected a close-up of Hawthorne's handwriting. Colonel Hawthorne, you spent 40 years ensuring my mission of mercy was never recognized because it violated your strict sense of procedure. You chose to protect an inflexible rulebook over the truth of saving human lives. Hawthorne scrambled to his feet. This is slander. Insubordination. Captain Vance was a known liability who wasted resources. Wasted resources? Ellie asked, her eyes burning with 40 years of suppressed pain. She pulled the last item from her envelope, Klaus's crayon drawing. I have the receipt, Colonel. It is a drawing from a little boy who saw an American soldier treat him like a child, not an enemy. This drawing proves that compassion is not a waste, but a strategic success. She placed the drawing on the podium. The room was utterly silent. People stared at Hawthorne, then at the simple image of a kind woman. Hawthorne, unable to deny the documentation Clara had passed to the editor, simply turned and walked out of the mess hall. He was not cheered. He was not chased. He was simply exposed by the paper trail he tried to bury. The audience, mostly older veterans and their spouses, started to realize the depth of the injustice. They didn't see the administrative captain. They saw the woman who sacrificed everything for simple human kindness. Ellie had earned her respect, but as she left the hall, the victory felt cold. She had won the battle for the truth, but the children she saved were still a vague, distant memory. Clara's article, based on Ellie's documents and titled The American Lady Who Saw Children, Not Soldiers, went beyond the local South Carolina paper. It was picked up by major wire services, then translated into German, and eventually found its way into a small history journal across the Atlantic. Ellie returned to her quiet life in the archives, finally having the budget and freedom to formally document the Kleine Kinder operation. The archive was now recognized as containing the true history, and Hawthorne faded into obscurity. But Ellie still felt an aching lack of closure. She knew she had done right, but she never knew what became of the boys. Then, 3 weeks after the article ran, a thick envelope arrived at the Fort Clay archives. The return address was Munich, Germany. Inside was a letter, written in slightly hesitant English. Dear Captain Vance, I saw the picture of the drawing in the newspaper. It is the drawing I gave you. My name is Klaus Schneider. I was the boy with the blue eyes. Ellie collapsed into her chair, the letter shaking in her hands. Klaus explained that the 5 days of kindness, the chocolate, and the firm, clean sheets had been the turning point of his life. He was able to get to a relative, finish school, and eventually became a successful engineer. You saved more than our lives, Captain, the letter concluded. You saved our faith in humanity. We never forgot you. You were the mother we lost in the war. Klaus wrote that he and 4 others of the Kleine Kinder group, now grandfathers themselves, had kept in touch over the decades and wanted to visit her. 6 months later, the Fort Clay Mess Hall was draped not just with flags, but with banners of welcome. Ellie, dressed in a simple, elegant blue dress, stood waiting. A shuttle bus pulled up. Out stepped 5 elderly German men, their hair gray, their faces lined, but their eyes bright with anticipation. The moment Klaus stepped off, his blue eyes meeting hers across the distance, all 4 decades vanished. Klaus walked straight toward her, stopping just feet away. He didn't salute or shake her hand. He bowed slightly, and then, tears streaming down his face, he opened his arms and embraced her, a tiny, frail German boy hugging the strong, brave American woman who had given him a future. Thank you, Captain, Klaus whispered in German, his voice thick. Welcome home, children, Ellie whispered back, the tears finally coming. The other men quickly followed, surrounding her in a group hug. For 40 years, she had been insulted, underestimated, and denied recognition. But now, she was held by the living proof of her sacrifice. She didn't have a medal on a ribbon. She had 5 grateful, successful men, now grandfathers themselves, who were here to give her the only justice and redemption that truly mattered. The validation that her decision, her heart and her courage had changed the world one kindness at a time. The powerful twist was that she hadn't just won respect from her peers. She had earned the eternal love of the very people she risked everything to save.